It was a miserable July night. The temperature was 85, and I was soaking wet.
The badge pinned to my shirt said, County Sheriff. I'd been one for almost 20 years.
I don't usually get called in at 3 o'clock in the morning.
But as the weather gets hotter, I get in a bad mood. And every now and then one of our fine citizens gets the bright idea to drink too much and hurt his wife. 2 of my guys responded to the call. When they arrived on the scene, the asshole decided to add another 10 years to his sentence by shooting them.
That's when they called me. Red and blue blinkers lit up the neighborhood, if you could call a collection of dilapidated mobile homes that. The gunman's dilapidated dwelling was mostly painted a rust color, and some of the paneling was shabby.
There was no sign of air conditioning, which might explain its behavior.
We thought about putting some extra ventilation in his pathetic little hotbox to let the varmint out.
But killing innocent bystanders doesn't suit the voters, and our 9 miles would have gone all the way through his house and a couple of neighbors. Plus, the idiot's wife was there, and she didn't provide us with convincing evidence that we should eliminate her from the gene pool.
Even if culling her husband would be good for humanity.
So we just sat in the heat listening to the squeaking katydids and loud rants inside. I imagine the dude regretted shooting us. In fact, I imagine he regretted opening his 3rd bottle of Jack at all.
I sighed and said, "We're going to stay here forever if I don't do something about it." I looked at both of my men and asked, "Do you guys care if he shot you?" Both of them shook their heads no. That's when I took a deep breath and stood up. A gunshot whistled over my head. I shouted, "If you come out right now, Melvin, we won't charge you with shooting at us. If you shoot again, you'll do 10 years. If you hit me, it's life. So, what's the choice? You have 10 seconds to decide."
There was a pause. Then the trailer door opened, and out stepped Melvin, unshaven, wearing a woman's smudged sweatshirt. He held his hands up. I said, "Smart move, buddy." Then I grabbed him and cuffed him. God! He stank. I handed it to 2 patrolmen and they not so gently threw it into the back seat of their car. I said tiredly, "You 2 get the wife's statement and then put him away." They were on duty. I wasn't. I got in my cruiser and headed back down Wisconsin 121. It had been a crazy night, and I wanted a couple more hours in the car before the sun came up. Geographically, Wisconsin sits between the Great Western Prairies, the frosty Canadian North, and the dynamic Great Lakes Bowl. As such, the weather here can get pretty wild. A long string of hot summer days hit the entire state, and we locals knew what that meant. When the weather turns bad, you'll have to pay the devil back. I got lucky, and the devil decided the bill was overdue. All my senses, sight, smell, touch and hearing, told me a storm was coming. The hot, humid wind intensified. The fast-moving air was charged with electricity. I thought, great. Armageddon. The trailer park was located outside of Perkinstown. So my route took me through the heavily forested Plain State Natural Area. I was just pulling onto the bridge over the Chequamegon waters when the storm, which had been just a flicker of lightning in the distance, broke with renewed vigor. There's nothing like being on a bridge over dark water in the middle of a thunderstorm. It's terrifying. The first thing that happens is the wind gusts. Fortunately, my cruiser was built to police specs and could withstand that. But the wind still rocked it on the suspension. Then the first fat drops appeared. The impact of them sounded like I had swept through a huge swarm of Wisconsin June bugs. As I entered the woods, I dropped my speed to 20 miles per hour and turned on the windshield wipers. They didn't help. It felt like I was driving through a car wash. I was getting worried. The windshield wipers were on full blast. But I couldn't see 10 feet in front of me. Then the lightning started. It was a continuous series of forked strikes all around me in the woods. The noise of the thunder was simply terrifying. I couldn't drive any farther. I've been a police officer for 3 decades now and have faced many scary situations. But sitting there alone, in that forest, was the scariest thing I have ever experienced. You couldn't see anything because of the rain, and the constant flashes of lightning and deafening rolls of thunder lit up the area with a nightmarish atmosphere.
An atavistic sense of dread came over me. It was probably related to the times when we lived in caves. Back then, we were prey, not hunters, and the overhanging trees and impenetrable darkness hid many terrible things. I quickly realized how prophetic that thought was. I once loved a woman, and I knew she loved me. I met her when I was investigating her murder. Her murder? Well, that requires a little explanation. I was a bright-eyed and bushy-tailed sheriff's detective married to a smart and beautiful woman. Janet was everything you could wish for in a wife until she got involved in politics. They say power corrupts. Well, my wife was a case in point. She stepped on a slippery slope and never got off. I was on the case. She got witness protection. I got a divorce. After that, I swore I would never have anything to do with these insidious creatures. Then I ran into Mavis. To tell you the truth, I almost ran her over. It certainly wasn't a classic boy meets girl situation. I was driving through Nicolay Forest in the middle of the night. The situation was eerily similar to my current predicament. Except it was raining hard, not the apocalypse. Mavis thought it was 1946. Naturally, I took her to have her head examined. The local doc confirmed that there were no bats in her bell tower, and she seemed to know things that the local historical society would envy. Plus, she dressed and behaved appropriately. Of course, her story didn't make any sense. That was until I started digging into it. After a couple weeks, I found a bunch of interesting things. A woman named Mavis Pritchett did disappear in 1946. I later learned that she had been murdered by one Felix Wynne. How did I know that? Well, Wynne confessed to the crime. He did it when he was dying at the age of 95. Meeting a man you thought you'd killed 70 years ago can be so heartbreaking. The problem was that while Wynne was in her 90s, Mavis was a stunningly beautiful 25-year-old with blue hair and a fresh face. It only added to her mystique. Having solved the murder, I was left alone with the question of what to do about Mavis. Let me describe her. She's smart, energetic, genuinely funny, brave, and deeply loving. She can cook like Julia Child and fuck you like Mata Hari on meth. The latter has happened every night of our lives. So, of course, I married her. Oh, yeah, the baby. You see, we kind of conceived her early in our relationship. We were planning on getting married anyway. So having little Ava was another blessing in a long line of wonderful things that have happened to me. Then I lived for 9 years with a man who was so excruciatingly beautiful and perfect in everything that makes women the superior species that I thought my heart would burst with happiness. Instead, he broke down. There was always that inconvenient fact that a person named Mavis was the victim of a 1946 murder. It couldn't have been my Mavis. She was clothed in luscious bodily flesh, and she was very much a part of the here and now. So all other options I dismissed under the heading alternative explanation required. That was until someone dug up a long-buried body. I rushed home and found the house empty. We used every investigative tool available. But it was like Mavis disappeared off the face of the earth. I finally accepted that she was gone forever. So I organized a memorial service for the body of a recently dug-up murder victim. Most people thought I was crazy. Except for 4 loyal friends. The grave is still there, on the hill next to the house. It is watched over by a marble angel and a grief-stricken husband. But life is a march or die proposition, and I was afraid to die. So I marched. My 9-year-old daughter saved me. It was the love and devotion I put into raising Ava that helped me get on the rails. Ava makes me proud of her. At the age of 21, she is an exact replica of her mother. A stunning young woman with a perfect body, honed by years of dancing, and a flawless face, which in Mavis's case was so beautiful that it drove an unstable man to murder. I'm still just the county sheriff. I do the best I can. But people never see me smile. Unless they're with me on that lonely hill when I'm talking to my wife. They would think I was crazy if they heard me. But I truly believe I'm right there with her then. I parked in the middle of the road, waiting for nature to deal with its end of the world. My blinkers signaled my presence. There was a series of violent thumps on the ground, and then the sky above the trees lit up with ball lightning. What happened the next instant after that, I don't know. I do remember that the rain let up, as if someone had pulled the curtain. And I was looking down at a rutted gravel road with a bright sunny sky overhead. It was deeply unsettling because the last time I saw this road it was pitch black and the sky was by no means serene. I started the cruiser, put it in gear, and sped down the road. It took me almost an hour to get to the end of the woods. That in itself was confusing. By my calculations, it was no more than a mile to the open countryside. The road was gravel until I got to Wisconsin 73, where there was a narrow concrete road instead of a wide 2-lane state road. Where was I staying? I turned the laptop to bring up the navigation program. But the browser was not connected to the internet. Nor was there any sign of the monster storm that had just passed over me. Was that puzzling? So, I turned south and drove down Highway 73 on a bright Wisconsin morning. I felt like I'd slept through the night instead of spending most of it trying to get the drunken loser out of his squalid dwelling. My watch read 8:45. I had no recollection of the lost time. But I must have fallen asleep during the storm. That was the only way I could explain the gap. The fields were full of corn, and I saw farmers on antique Ford tractors. There were no big combines or other farm equipment here that I was used to seeing. A few people stopped to gawk at the cruiser as I drove by. It seemed like they had never seen a Crown Vic before. I got to Cadott and turned onto State Highway 27, heading for home. Everywhere I went, people were staring at me. It was like I was driving a flying saucer. I got to the hot spot, parked, and went inside for my morning cup of joe. When I sat down at the table, everyone but the waitress rushed to the window. I looked around the diner. It must have been remodeled. Because there were stools set up along the counter and tables instead of booths. It was like they wanted to create a kitschy diner. The waitress came over. She was new since the last time I was here. She asked, "What can I get you, Sheriff?" She noticed my uniform, badge and tool belt, Glock 19, extra ammo, pepper spray, handcuffs and ASP. I said, "Coffee and eggs." She turned to the kid hanging around behind the counter and said, "Get the sheriff some coffee. I thought, interesting that the current owner's name is Dot, too. The child was very beautiful and clearly intelligent. She was about 12, just beginning to find her figure, and it promised to be no nonsense. She took a cup from the stack and poured coffee from an elaborate antique coffee pot. It looked like the kind they show in old cartoons. The 1940s vibe was getting stronger. The little girl asked, "What's that car you're driving? Does it look like a P-51? I had never heard an old, scraggly Crown Vic compared to a World War II fighter jet before. I proudly said, "This is a Ford Crown Victoria Police Interceptor with the Apprehender package. It can go up to 150 miles an hour if I need it to." The girl's eyes widened. She asked excitedly, "Can I ride in it?" She was indeed feisty. She had also apparently never heard of Raptors. I said, "I'll take you for a ride if your mom approves. But you must never get into a car with strangers." She turned to the waitress, who was obviously her mother, and screamed, "MAAA. Can I ride in the sheriff's car?" The waitress put the scrambled eggs in front of me and said irritably, "Stop bothering Dot's man. We need you here." Then she turned to me and said, "That'll be 2 pieces." It took me a second to translate that into English. I asked, "You mean the whole breakfast is a quarter?" She defended herself, "We charge more because all the produce is fresh." Pulling a quarter out of my pocket, I thought, they must be having some kind of promotion to publicize the new decor. The waitress looked at the quarter and said, "Wait a minute, what's this?" I said, "It's a quarter." She said, "No, it isn't. It's a quarter," and held out one of those old-fashioned coins that were around before they had state symbols on the back. I dug in my pocket, found an old coin and said, "Do you collect old coins?" holding it out to her. The waitress replied, "What are you talking about? This one is from this year."
Her quarter had 1946 stamped on the bottom under Washington's head.
I felt dizzy for a moment. I sat back down on the stool and said, "Wait a minute. What's the date?" The waitress looked at me like she thought I was playing a joke on her and said, "Today is July 29th. I asked with growing concern, "What year?" She thought I was joking. She laughed heartily and said, "Last time I checked it was 1946. Isn't it, Dot?" Dot giggled and mischievously replied, "No, I think it's 1846.
The reality of my situation was becoming more and more apparent.
This was the real Dot. The last time I had seen her was a week ago. She was 82 years old. I hurriedly ate and left. Maybe I was hit by one of the lightning bolts. Maybe I had an aneurysm and was lying unconscious in the middle of the woods. Maybe I really was transported back to the 1940s? Whatever it was, I was clearly no longer in Kansas. I should have been shocked. But I'm a hard-headed practitioner. The cause and effect of my situation didn't matter to me. The only thing I was thinking about was that Mavis was still alive and I could save her. I memorized every detail of the case. The murder didn't happen until 2 days later, on the 31st. Of course, I had a problem. In 1946, Mavis Pritchett was a complete stranger. I'll deal with that later. But first I had to get rid of the cruiser. The last thing I wanted was people asking me questions, and the cruiser was attracting too much attention. More importantly, I needed money. I had plenty of 21st century cash. But I'd be washing dishes at the diner if I didn't dig up an old quarter. I could kill 2 birds with 1 stone by selling the Crown Vic. There was a garage in Fall Creek that had been in continuous operation since the 1930s. The garage was in good order. It looked prosperous, and it sold cars. I chuckled happily, the owner must love what I have to offer. I parked and opened the hood. 4 men got up from their seats to come over and stare. Then a guy came out who was obviously the owner. They all looked puzzled. I counted on the uniform and equipment to make my case. The owner was a rough-looking fellow, tall and thin, in grease-stained overalls. He approached me, not too friendly, and said, "What can I do for you, Sheriff?" It was clear that neither of them liked cops. I said in my friendliest tone, "I want to sell this fine automobile. The department doesn't need it anymore, and I want it to go to someone local. For a good price, I'll give you the shotgun and the special radio." The owner looked skeptical. He asked, "What is this thing anyway?" Without blinking an eye, I replied, "It's a Lamborghini." Although the blue oval clearly said Ford. I added convincingly, "This is an experimental machine. The government gave it to us. They made it out of parts from one of their fighter planes." Dot gave me the idea. One of the loungers said, "How fast is he going down the Sheriff?" I said, "It will go up to 150. But you can drive it at 120 all day long." They all gasped in amazement. Since most of their passenger airplanes flew at less than 200 miles per hour, this was an unheard of speed. It was evident that the owner wanted her so badly that his teeth ached. He asked, "What do you want for it?" It originally cost $56,000. I knew I'd have to bring the price back to 1940s prices. I said, $5,000. I could have said I might as well have asked for $50 million. The owner shrugged eloquently and started to walk away. I hastily added, "Okay, since you're local, I'll give you this fine automobile for $2,000 cash if you give me that little beauty over there." I pointed to an immaculate blue 1940 Ford convertible. In those days, $2,000 was a year's salary. But the guy's eyes lit up like he thought he'd stolen a cruiser. We drove to the Fall Creek Bank. The owner had been playing with the gun stacked on the front seat the whole time. I said irritably, "If you put a hole in the roof, you still bought it." He said, "What's that?" He pointed to the laptop between us. I said, "This is an experimental radio that the government is using to track spies." In the electronic surveillance world of the 21st century, this was no exaggeration. The owner withdrew $200 bills and handed me the money. We drove back. He handed me the title and the keys to the Ford. I handed him the keys and signed over the title to the cruiser. I hoped he wouldn't pay attention to the year of the car. Then we shook hands and I left. The first phase was over. I needed a place to stay. So I went back to the hot spot. Dot was standing at the counter polishing a soda glass. She asked, "What happened to your car?" I said, "I changed it to something much cooler." I was getting into that 1940s slang. Dot looked at the little roadster that was parked outside with the top down and nodded approvingly. I asked, "Are there any boarding houses nearby?" She replied, "Sure, Sheriff. My mom has one. Would you like me to show you?" And she rushed behind the counter, grabbed my hand, and dragged me out the door. We walked to the next block. Dot never let go of my hand. Had I discovered a crush? We found ourselves in front of one of those big, massive, stone, two-story colonial houses. The kind you see in wealthy neighborhoods in Wisconsin. Dot pulled me inside without ceremony. Her mom had shed her waitress uniform and was standing in a homemade dress, and her hair was styled in a bandana. She was clearly in the middle of cleaning. Moreover, she looked exactly like Eva Peterson, Doc's wife. Dot would soon look like her mother, whose name was Barbara, and Eva looked like Dot. So apparently Swedish beauty was hereditary. Dot replied nonchalantly, "The sheriff needs a place to stay while he's in town." Mama Dot said, "For $5 a week you can get a room with full board." I know it's a lot, but I'm a good cook. I pulled out one of my hundreds. She looked at me as if I had handed her a sack of gold doubloons. I said, "This is for 5 months ahead, in case I need them." I thought, man, I've got to break one of these hundreds. Before I went looking for Mavis, I had one more thing to do. I had to buy a toothbrush and some 1940s clothes. There was a dry goods store on Main Street. It was next to a hardware store and only 2 blocks from my new place of residence. So I went there on foot. I've been to a lot of clothing stores. But I've never been in one like this. Clothes lay in baskets. There were no subtle marketing gimmicks here, and the owner followed you around recommending things. There was also a boardwalk floor, musty smell, and the general appearance of a feed store rather than a place with fine men's accessories. The owner was an older man, very well dressed and well mannered by rural Wisconsin standards. He was talking neighborly to a guy in his 30s who had a lot of dark hair and a thin Clark Gable mustache over his lip. Both men were much smaller than me. I had noticed that about almost every man I had met so far. They examined my outfit, and one of them held out his hand and said, "Welcome to our town, Sheriff. I'm William Morton, the town doctor, and this is my friend Stanley Wilkes." "Where are you from?" I took his hand, shook it, and said, "My jurisdiction is a long way from here. I'm in town to clear up the details of a murder case." Really? It was the truth. The jurisdiction was 70 years in the future, and no murders were to occur under my watch. I was aware of the irony. If I had prevented the murder, the Mavis I would meet 70 years later would be in her 90s. But I firmly believed I was here for a reason, and the only one I could think of was to prevent what was going to happen in 2 days. I loved Mavis with every fiber of my being. So I didn't want her to be harmed, no matter what the consequences for me. I replied with a sad smile, "My luggage got mixed up on the way here." "Yes, of course. By about 7 decades. I added, grinning, "I can't wear this uniform all the time. So I need clothes for the first time, a couple of shirts, pants, and other necessities." Doc made comments while his buddy helped me. In those days, people didn't run to the doctor for every little thing. It was obvious Doc had a lot of free time on his hands. He said, "We have a nice little town. The people are very friendly. We haven't had a sheriff since Orville Hickenlooper died, and we could use one. When you get the murder case solved, you might want to think about settling here. I know they could use you." I thought, if this isn't a dream, I think I'll take him up on his offer. The total cost of 3 short-sleeved plaid shirts, a week's supply of boxers, and 2 pairs of khaki pants was almost $24. I paid the man with one of my hundreds. He looked puzzled. Doc said kindly, "Why don't I take you to our bank and we can break that amount down for you?" So, he led me down the street to the bank. The main thing I noticed about the bank was the lack of electronics: no ATMs, no workstations, no screens in the cash registers, just ledgers and cash drawers. Another feature was the homely, small-town atmosphere. Everyone knew each other and there was a lot of banter. It was like a family restaurant. Not the sterile bank atmosphere I was used to. I broke the first 100 and got a bunch of change for another. Doc chattered all the way down and back about what a nice little town it was. It wasn't really much different from what it was in the next century. There were a few buildings missing, and there were more open lots and alleys. But overall, the look of the town was completely familiar. The haberdasher actually wrapped my purchases in paper and tied them with twine. I said thank you and was already carrying them out the door when I suddenly met my fate. Mavis hurried down the street. She lowered her eyes and looked a little upset. The door of the dry goods store faced the sidewalk, and I didn't see her approach. I stepped out and we bumped into each other. I'm 6'2". She's 5'2". You can imagine who won that fight. I grabbed her by both arms to keep her from falling to the street. Then I turned her around to face me. She looked into my eyes, and I could feel the energy shimmering across 7 decades. And so did she. She looked amazed and horrified at the same time. I had the advantage. All Mavis saw was a menacing lawman in a Smokey Bear hat and tools strapped to his belt. But I had lived with her for almost 10 years as my favorite wife and the mother of my child. And yet I couldn't get my hands on the wedding album. It was too early. I said formally, "Excuse me, miss." She just stood there staring at me with her mouth open, a storm of emotion in those incredible porcelain blue eyes. I was on edge myself. I loved her, and fate had taken her from me. But I was pragmatic enough to hold my cards. My only goal was to get her back. I said, trying not to give away my feelings, "I know you from somewhere, don't I?" I fought the urge to throw her over my shoulder and head for the nearest justice of the peace. She shook herself like a dog on the dryer and hesitantly said, "I don't believe the sheriff." It was obvious that she thought she knew me too. But she, also, found it prudent to keep her cards close to her adorable breasts. As soon as Mavis said this, a small smarmy handsome man with bow-tie lips and an Elvis-style hairdo grabbed her arm and said, "What are you doing talking to that guy, Mavis? You're my girl." The condescension and possessiveness in his voice almost made me reach for ASP. She replied, "Don't throw off your wig. I was just talking to Sheriff Jimmy." Okay, they'd probably find our 21st century lingo wild, too. He said, "Well, you'd better get on with it, or I might find myself another girl." And he dragged her up the steps to her apartment. She looked back at me longingly. At that moment, Doc came out. He watched the two of them enter the apartment. He said, "This is Jimmy Rollins. He's a worthless brat. But his parents have money. She's a pretty girl. I don't know what she's doing with him. I guess taste doesn't count. Mavis respects strength in a man. So she'll gravitate toward anyone who strikes her as decisive. Jimmy boy was an arrogant little shit. So I understood why she was with him. Of course, I planned to change that arrangement. I was just getting into the car when Mavis moaned from the wide-open windows of her apartment. Air conditioning was a rarity in the 40s. So, of course, the windows were open. I thought, great. Just what I needed to hear. I didn't have much to say about it yet. Technically, I shouldn't have been born for another 27 years. But the sound of the love of my life making sexual music with another man was just killing me. Dot saw me off at 7 the next morning. I slept like a dead man in her mother's cozy house. Dot said, "It's Tuesday, and it's my day off. So you can take me for a ride in your little car." I liked her chutzpah. I asked, "What does your mom think about this?" Dot laughed and said, "She thinks you're wonderful. Maybe you'll be my other daddy." I said with a laugh, "Out. You already have one." Her father was an elderly Swede whose English was questionable. But he clearly loved his daughter very much. I think it was this unconditional love that made Dot so energetic. Breakfast was at the hot spot. That was one of the advantages of living in the house. Dot and I were just finishing up when Jimmy and Mavis came in and sat down at a neighboring table. Dot came over and joined them. She was excitedly telling Mavis how we planned to spend the day. Jimmy looked like he was portraying James Dean's character in the movie Rebel Without a Cause. But in his case, the impression was more like Rebel Without a Cause. He was wearing a 1940s punk uniform, a white t-shirt with a pack of Luckies rolled up one sleeve, a pair of old-fashioned tight blue jeans, and motorcycle boots. His thick black hair was neatly styled into a greasy waterfall on his forehead. The grease dripped slowly down his nose. Mavis loves kids. I already knew that. She was a fantastic mom in another sphere. She chatted animatedly with Dot, while she looked at me longingly. She still looked embarrassed. I didn't blame her. I didn't feel any better than she did. Dot chatted about this and that, and then Dick decided it was time to be an asshole. He grabbed Mavis and spun her around in her chair. He said angrily, "Stop talking to that brat. You're supposed to be with me. I will not tolerate disrespect for my woman." Mavis has a temper, and Dick Bright made her mad. I thought, oh. She shook off his hands and stood up. She said with fury in her voice, "Don't you dare talk to me like that. If you can't be a gentleman, then maybe I'll go with Dot and the sheriff." Then she came over to where I was standing, took my hand, and said, "Can I ride with you until Jimmy learns some manners?" Jimmy jumped to his feet and approached me threateningly. He was a small guy, probably 5'6", maybe 140, who looked like a rooster. He said, "She's my girlfriend, so back off or I'll ruin it for you." He was addressing my breasts. I had to laugh. It was unfortunate because it made him flinch away. I caught his fist in midair. It felt like a little girl. Then I slowly plowed him to the floor, on my knees. He struggled to wrestle his fist from my hand, calling me names I didn't want Dot to hear. But my little friend was clearly enjoying every second of it. Mavis looked horrified and utterly aroused. I said, "Mavis is a grown woman and a respected teacher in our community. She can do whatever she wants, and if she wants to come with me and Dot to Eau Claire, she's welcome to do so." Then I added in a threatening tone, "I'm going to let go of your hand now, and I strongly advise you not to drag this out any longer. Needless to say, we'll have another talk if you take it out on Mavis." I twisted his arm with force to hurt him. He cried out and sat on the floor, clutching his wrist. The other customers looked at me approvingly. Apparently, I wasn't the only person in town who thought Dickface was a pain in the ass. The three of us walked out of the hot spot and got into my shiny blue Ford, Mavis in the front, me and Dot in the back, leaning back in the seat. Jimmy watched us from the steps of T. He diner. Jimmy shouted, "Take the whore. I don't want her slutty ass anyway." I almost jumped back out of the car. But Jimmy quickly ducked into the diner. I'd been a cop for a long time. I knew we hadn't heard the last of him. It was a beautiful sunny day in Wisconsin on Tuesday, July 30th. So the top was down. Now that it was just Mavis and me, our past love began to work its mysterious magic. Couples who have been married for a long time and have managed to keep something special alive have a deep bond that binds them together on some deep subconscious level. Mavis and I have had such a bond throughout our married life. Now the future was affecting our present. Mavis stopped looking at me. Instead, she did a sort of feminine thing where she sort of merged with me. We were only lightly touching physically. But our hearts were beating together and our thoughts were on the same page. Dot said from the back seat, "I don't want to go to Eau Claire. It's too far, and you two scare me." I said brightly, "Then how about a picnic?" I looked at Mavis. She was looking at me with a mixture of awe, lust, and confusion. I realized. The feelings were so strong, they had to come from somewhere. But she couldn't figure out where. I had an advantage. I knew her future was our past. We bought some tasty snacks at the market. It was a small store, not a supermarket. Everything was amazingly fresh.
Then I took us a little out of town to a place overlooking the mill pond. To get there, we had to cross a small stream. I helped Mavis over the rocks, and Dot jumped over, nimble as a little cat. We spread a blanket on the edge of the cliff. This is where our house would stand 7 decades from now. But now it was just a quiet spot in the woods. I could tell Mavis had caught the mood.
That's what I assumed.
She loved her house and had made it a happy home for almost 10 years.
She continued to look at me with bewilderment.
I had to enlighten her.
But what is there to say?
Hi, I'm your husband from 70 years in the future, and we're sitting in the place where our house will be. I know it sounds a little strange, but it's true, trust me. She would have run screaming to the authorities, waving a personal protection order.
So I kept holding my cards, waiting for the universe to decide what to do with us.
One thing I knew for sure, Mavis wasn't going to get hurt.
She was obviously happy to be with us.
I watched as she chatted with Dot about the ducks. They were both looking at the mill pond. So I managed to avoid seeing her. It was painful to be so close and yet so far away at the same time.
God!
I missed her so much. Then he and Dot, still laughing and chatting, began to climb a small hill, where a small willow tree was just beginning to spread its characteristic drooping branches. The girls wanted it to have the best view of the mill pond.
I'd seen a similar scenario hundreds of times.
Except the little girl walking with Mavis was our daughter.
I smiled fondly as I remembered it. And then it hit me.
She was about to stand where I'd buried her. I jumped to my feet and was about to yell, "Mavis," when they appeared. She held Dot's hand. They turned to look at the creek, which was full of wild birds. Then Mavis collapsed abruptly and without a word, like a balloon deprived of air. I rushed to her. Dot was on her knees, clinging to my hand, and repeating in a distressed tone, "Mavis, Mavis." I picked her up in my arms and carried her back down the slope. It was the first time I had held her in my arms since the day I lost her. It was excruciating. Mavis began to come to her senses as soon as I relieved her of the effects of the stain. She clung to me in terror. I guessed what had happened, but I had no words.
How do you tell a man that he is standing on his own grave?
I said, "You'll be all right now, Mavis."
You must have eaten something.
Yeah, ridiculous, but what else could I say to her? She looked at me with huge eyes and said, I felt like I was stepping into the void.
I was falling into nothingness. I said soothingly, it was probably just low blood sugar.
I've dealt with this sort of thing before.
I am a police officer, after all.
Seriously?
I sounded more like a politician.
What I said must have satisfied her.
I lowered her to the ground.
She was unsteady on her feet.
She took my hand again and laughed in relief.
I'm sorry I scared you too.
Dot chuckled and said, "Thanks for the introduction. I'd never seen anyone faint before."
Dot was an energetic little gal, and I knew she wouldn't lose that vigor one bit in the next 70 years.
I said, "I guess I'd better take you home."
Mavis nodded gratefully.
We gathered our things and headed to the car.
Mavis and I had spent enough time together that all walls had been broken down.
So as we drove back to Main Street, we felt an easy camaraderie.
I dropped Dot off at the hotspot and drove to Mavis's. I saw Jimmy's face disappear from her apartment window as we pulled up.
Mavis got out of the car and walked over to me.
It was obvious that it was as hard for her to part with me as it was for me to part with her.
But, as I said, how do you start a conversation that we will eventually have to have?
I replied unconvincingly, "I hope to see you again."
She readily replied, "Oh yes, Sheriff. I'd like that very much."
I said worriedly, "If Jimmy gives you any trouble, I'm only 2 blocks away.
At Barbara Hanson's boarding house."
She smiled sweetly and said, "Don't worry about Jimmy, Sheriff.
I can handle him. He loves me too much for me to handle him."
Then she turned and walked slowly up the stairs. The well-remembered rippling of those round, muscular buns reminded me of the endless nights of passion we had shared. I knew she was too good for Jimmy.
I also knew that he and I would meet again.
I handled the case as a routine police operation.
In some respects, it was. I was going to prevent a murder.
So I had to know all the details of the area.
As a result, I spent the rest of the day and the next on reconnaissance.
I was well aware that if I stopped Mavis' murder, it would change a lot of things in the timeline.
Perhaps it was selfish of me, because the consequences would be inevitable. But whatever happened in the 21st century had already happened on my timeline.
So there was no way to undo it. It was obvious that Mavis's attitude toward me was influenced by the force that had brought me to this moment, as I supposed, by the love we felt for each other.
Had it not been so, I was sure she would not have been so instantly attracted.
After all, I had just met her, and she did have a steady boyfriend. There was a problem with the guy. I didn't think Mavis loved him, as she needed a man in her life. That was one of her characteristics. She wasn't happy without a guy she could commit to. And she was fiercely devoted to whoever that lucky guy was.
In my not-so-humble opinion, Jimmy was a skell.
In my years on the force, I had seen thousands like him. He was a weak, deluded and narcissistic little man whose main claim to fame was that he had some money and a dick.
But the real culprit, as I already knew, was Felix Wynn.
The last time I'd seen Wynn was when he was lying stone dead in the nursing home. I knew he wouldn't look like the mummy he looked like then.
So I wanted to check him out. God!
I started to think of the 21st century as those times.
It was confusing my timeline.
Anyway, I wanted to find out what Wynn had been like when he was young. But first I had to find him, and the internet wouldn't be around for another 50 years.
So I had to resort to old-fashioned technology. It was surprisingly effective.
I walked down Main Street to the phone booth at the corner of Lincoln and Lafayette Streets.
Inside was a payphone. I hadn't seen one of those since I was a kid. But I didn't go there to make a call. I wanted the phone book. It was surprisingly thin.
Of course, there were only a few thousand people in the whole county in 1946, and most of them didn't have telephones.
I opened it and ran my fingers over the page that read, Wynn, Felix R. He lived on the west side of town by the railroad tracks. Maybe because it was a short walk to the high school.
I knew from the 21st century case files that Wynn had gotten off track when both he and Mavis were teaching there.
Mavis is stunningly beautiful.
She radiates an eroticism that would drive any man crazy. But most guys obey the rules.
Wynn doesn't. Wynn was doing what we call sexual harassment.
But guys in 1946 called it flirting. Anyway, Mavis didn't like it, so she complained to the district.
She was ignored.
Until one day Wynn snapped and tried to fuck Mavis on the teacher's desk. Mavis' cries for help drew a crowd, and several male teachers pulled Wynn away from her. The whole thing was so unheard of and shameful to the district that they covered it up by firing both of them.
Was it fair? They thought so at the time.
As a result, the guy, clearly suffering from a mental disorder, was wandering around waiting for the next shot at the object of his obsession. If I don't do something, this is going to end up killing Mavis. I floated past Wynn's shack. It was made of weathered boards and looked like it had 2 rooms, and the trash was in the backyard.
It was still very hot. He was sitting on the porch in a woman's sweatshirt and suspender pants. I parked and walked over to him. He stood up incredulously. He was bigger than Jimmy.
But most people were, even in those days.
He looked to be 5'8" and weighed 180 pounds.
He clearly considered himself a ladies' man. His thick black hair was swept back from his forehead with what was then called hair tonic.
It was mostly oil.
Wynn had a mustache as thin as Doc's. Clark Gable was still an icon among the leading men of the movies. He had small beady eyes next to a too big nose and thin, angry lips.
I made my most innocent tourist face and said, "I'm lost, mister. Do you know where Fall Creek is?" Wynn looked me over from head to toe. He was an arrogant son of a bitch. But I was a helpless tourist, so I averted my eyes as if I were intimidated. Wynn said, "Get off my property or I'll shoot you." I said, You don't have to act like that, buddy. I'm just looking for the road.
Win got up and headed for his crumbling house.
I knew he'd come out with a shotgun. God help me, I was tempted. I could have just shot him on the spot and gotten it over with. I knew plenty of places to bury the body. But I wanted to play it out so that it would be as close to what happened as possible. I just had to know. I turned and ran back to the car. Win, laughing, shot into the air. I started the Ford and hurried out onto the road and back into town. I saw my adversary and understood him. Now all that was left to do was wait for the cards to be dealt. It was dusk, and I was watching from my car, which was parked in front of Mavis's apartment. I hunched over in the seat. I'd been a cop for a long time, and I could do surveillance as well as the best. No one saw me. I haven't seen Mavis from the picnic. But I saw the dress. She was coming down the stairs in the same outfit she wore when I met her in the future. She was clearly wearing her best clothes. She was wearing a short wool skirt that showed off her stunning legs, old-fashioned nylon shoes with a seam in the back, 3-inch heels, and a beautiful white blouse. The whole ensemble was completed with a brightly colored short wool jacket to match the skirt. Judging by the weather, she was wearing her only good outfit. It must have been about 80 outside, and the sun had long since set. Only a girl dressed to impress would wear something like that in this heat. She stood under a streetlight in front of Doc's clinic and waited for the bus to Cadott. It followed State Highway 27 all the way to Cornell. A bus pulled up. She climbed into it, and it moved off. Turning right onto 27th, the bus slowly headed toward Cadott and Mavis's ultimate fate. I shifted the Ford into gear and followed him. They dropped Mavis off at the entrance to the Crescent Moon. This establishment has survived into the next century. It looked like an old barn converted into a bar. The only difference was the sign out front. It was lit by a single green light bulb, not modern neon. Mavis climbed the steps to the porch and went inside. I parked and waited 15 minutes. There was a big party going on. There were people snooping around, and many of them were drunk. I remembered that it was a reunion for one of the locals. He had just returned from World War II. Mavis stood out in the midst of all this merriment. She sat at the table with a depressed look. Jimmy sat beside her with his hand on the back of her chair, smoking a Lucky and exchanging barbs with all his friends. There were drinks in front of them. I knew what had been spiked in Mavis's drink. I read the autopsy results. The presence of chloral hydrate was part of the case file. Looking around, I saw a few things. Win was sitting behind the bar smoking, looking as nervous as the proverbial cat. The other was Mavis' face. She had 2 black eyes. I've heard that people actually see the color red when they go crazy. But I had never experienced this phenomenon until now. My cop brain was screaming at me to calm down, because my mission was to prevent Mavis' murder. But the part of me that loved my wife was reaching for the ASP. ASP is 8 inches of a special metal alloy. It can be carried in your pocket. With a flick of the hand, it transforms into a 2-foot-long fighting baton. The metal is made in such a way that the tip of the baton is flexible. So it can be swung at near supersonic speeds. So the result of the baton is like a gunshot. My emotions were too turbulent. I needed to get out of this place before I did something stupid. I stood up and sprinted out the door. Reaching the parking lot, I leaned over and put my hands on my knees. I breathed deeply, trying to regain my self-control. After a while my anger subsided, and I turned to go back into the house. Just then I heard a mocking voice say, "What's the matter? Are you too cowardly to fight me?" Mavis disrespected me. I beat her up and sold her whore ass to Felix Wynn. Now it's your turn. I looked up into the smug, smirking face of Jimmy Rollins. He stood there, all misplaced self-confidence. Behind him in a semicircle stood about 8 of his friends. His friends contributed to his misguided sense of self-confidence. I thought, pennies from heaven. This fool hit my wife and drugged her, and now I'm going to charge him.
The thought that this jerk might use his fists on Mavis' tender flesh infuriated me. I said, trying not to show my excitement, "Okay, kid, come on." This chump jumped into a stance like the Marquis of Queensberry, fists up, left foot in front of the right.
I didn't have time to strut around like Gentleman Jim.
So I said in disgust, "Really?" and kicked him in the crotch. Jimmy had the foresight to spread his legs like that. It made it much more effective. I put all my fury into it, and it lifted Jimmy half a foot off the ground.
He let out a loud strangled wheeze and rolled over onto his back. It was convenient, since I didn't have to lift my knee as far to hit him face down.
I heard the facial bones crunch.
Jimmy boy wasn't going to be as handsome or as manly as he used to be.
He fell to the ground. I bent down, grabbed his right arm and jerked it away from his body.
Then I struck him with my heel.
He screamed in agony.
The loud crunch of bones was music to my ears.
This may seem too ruthless, but it was with this very hand that he struck my wife.
He wouldn't use it on any other woman. The whole thing took about 5 seconds.
I turned to his friends, pulled out the ASP, flicked it around with a flick of my hand, and said, "Which one of you knuckleheads is next?" The biggest of them shouted, "That's not fair," and lunged at me.
I'm an expert on ASP. If you're in the police business, you should be. And I was in a hurry to get back to Mavis.
So I kneed him in the knee with one punch. I don't know how advanced orthopedic surgery was in the 1940s. But I was sure they could sew some of the ligaments back together.
I turned around, waving the ASP, and shouted, "Anyone else?" The rats scattered.
Jimmy lay on the ground in a fetal position and moaned loudly. He shat himself.
The other guy was crying like a little girl.
I was distracted for no more than 20 minutes.
But when I returned, I found to my horror that Mavis was no longer sitting there.
To make matters worse, Wynn wasn't there either. I'd been in tough situations, and none of them were worse than the day I lost Mavis. But that empty chair almost killed me. I muttered to myself under my breath, "Not again," and rushed to the car. The only logical place was Wynn's house. I knew where he lived, thanks to yesterday's visit. I didn't know how far ahead of me he was, but it didn't matter. I was going to arrive shortly after all of his planned festivities began. Wisconsin 27 was paved, but it was still a very narrow road. My trusty 1940 Roadster was powered by one of the classic Ford 239 flathead engines so beloved of 1950s hot rodders. I didn't know what Wynn drove, but I was sure I was faster. I drove 18 of the 20 miles between the Crescent and Wynn's house at 70 miles per hour.
These were 1940s roads in a 1940s car. If I had gone any faster, I would have ended up in the trees. I was almost to the city limits when the car began to shake and wobble. I instinctively slowed down. It was a wise decision, because that's when the right front tire blew out. I muttered to myself, shit, as I pulled the car to the curb. Some people would sit there and pound the steering wheel in frustration. But I was in a state of panic, and adrenaline was rushing through my blood. I was still 3/4 of a mile from where 27th meets Main Street, and then another mile from the Wynn house. But yesterday's careful reconnaissance had paid off. I knew that 27th Street led into town. If I had been driving, I would have made it to the intersection and then turned right to head back out of town to the house. But in a straight line through the woods and a freshly plowed field, I was only a 1/4 mile away. I jumped out of the car and dashed through the trees as fast as I could. I jumped over Bridge Creek and found a path in the thicket that led to the open fields around the high school. It was close to 11 p.m., but the moon was full and the July night was cloudless. As I drove, I pondered the time. It's been about an hour since I last saw Mavis. It would take some time for the drug to put her in a state where Wynn could get her out of the bar. Wynn took his time getting home because he didn't know anyone was after him, and he had all night. I figured he could be no more than 15 minutes ahead of me. As I crossed the farmer's field, I raced at full speed, aiming for Wynn's cabin. I had no time for stealth. There was only one door, and that was the front door. Wynn could have been waiting behind it with a shotgun. But he didn't know I was coming. I also knew he might be doing something else. My blood was boiling. Still, I didn't slow down, crept to the porch, and quietly opened the door. There was a mumbling sound. They were in the bedroom. I headed that way. ASP was fully deployed. I heard Win say, pleased with himself, "You're my woman now." Then there was a sigh and the sound of a sloppy kiss. It was followed by a loud cry of pain and a slap. I knew Mavis had bitten her lip and he had hit her. She told me about it during the investigation. She also used very unflattering language when describing Win's manhood. Her voice was interrupted by a guttural sound. Win leaned back, smothering Mavis. I was just coming to the foot of the bed. Win's hairy ass was firmly planted between my wife's widely spread legs. He used his own legs to keep them spread. His position was delightfully comfortable because it gave me a lot of his personal real estate to aim at. There was a distinctive crackle as the tip of the ASP went supersonic. And the first impact came right at the base of his nut sack. The impact sounded like a 9mm machine hitting a watermelon. I knew Win wouldn't have sex for the rest of his life. His prostate is right under that area, and I was sure I'd blown it apart along with his balls. Win shrieked and soared into the air. He looked like a marlin trying to free itself from a fishing line. Win landed back on Mavis, who let out an oof and started wriggling around trying to regain her breath. The bastard went completely limp as I grabbed him by his thick, greasy hair and pulled him off my wife. I was going to tell him about all the creative things I was going to do to him. But I realized I was wasting my breath. Felix Win was deader than the proverbial doornail. The pain must have been too much. I knew from the first time I saw him that he had a bad tick. All I had to do was get us out of there. I was confident that Win's death would be ruled natural. There were none of the usual signs of foul play, and forensic scientists in 1946 would never have guessed that the purple mark on his balls was an ASP punch. So Win was dead, and Jimmy Boy would be in the hospital for a very long time. All in all, a good day's work that I couldn't foresee any legal problems on Jimmy's part. This was rural Wisconsin in the 1940s, not a politically correct 21st century society. They would never prosecute a guy for fighting, especially if the fight was instigated by the victim and 8 of his friends. I looked at Mavis. She was naked, squirming on the bed, still trying to regain her breath. Her body was as incredible as ever, even if it was smeared with Win's cum. I walked over to the bed and sat on it. She flinched. I figured the last thing she wanted was to be touched by a man. So I said softly, "You're safe now, Mavis. No one will ever hurt you again. You are my wife, and I promise that I will protect you for the rest of your life." She stopped wriggling and started sobbing. It was pathetic. I said as humbly and respectfully as I could, "It's okay if I hug you, just to comfort you. I'm not like that guy." She nodded pathetically and sat up. Without a word, she wrapped her arms around my neck and sobbed on my shoulder. I put my arms around her and repeated over and over again, in the most soothing tone of voice, "It's okay, my love. I'm here and I'll never leave you." She finally stopped crying. I said, "If you are able to walk, my car is on the other side of the woods. If not, I'll carry you." She started to get up and collapsed back down. I asked, "Can I help you get dressed?" She nodded again. By now she hadn't uttered a word. I pulled her panties and dressed down her long beautiful legs to her ripe rounded thighs. She lay there, unresponsive to me. I made her sit up and gently helped her into her shirt, buttoning it over her luscious breasts. I did it without touching them. I threw the little coat over her. Then I put everything else, hat, pantaloons, belt, bra and shoes, into a handy burlap sack. I lifted my wife in my arms and carried her into the night. Her right arm wrapped around my neck and her head rested on my shoulder. She was light as a feather. I had forgotten how graceful she was. The walk through the fields and forests was breathtaking. I held her in my arms and thought, perhaps I have already died somewhere in the 21st century. But it doesn't matter. I am alive in this, and she is in my arms. I was happy for the first time since that disastrous day in November next year, which was either a decade in the past or 70 years in the future. God. It was confusing. I've already noticed a strange thing.
Our relative ages had been preserved when space was rebuilt. Mavis was 25 in 1946, while I was closer to 52 in real time. But in this reality, I was back to a 32-year-old version of myself, and believe me, I could feel the difference. As far as I knew, I was as dead now as Mavis had been when I'd met her.
Or maybe it was just the happy dream of a man lying in a deep coma. It didn't matter in the slightest.
I was with her in a vibrant post-war America, and that was all I cared about. It was like we were both completely rebooted. I opened the passenger door of the Ford and put her in the seat. I closed the door, and she immediately slid down into the seat. The fact that Mavis was still under the influence of the drug was a good thing. She probably wouldn't remember much about what had happened. I jacked the car up and changed the tire. My shirt was soaked from changing the tire and I was exhausted. I couldn't drive it back to the Hansons' house. So I drove to the only logical place, Mavis's apartment. I knew Jimmy wasn't going back there. I woke up on the bright and sunny afternoon of August 1st. I fell asleep in Mavis' only comfortable chair. I was still dressed in my short-sleeved plaid shirt and khakis. I looked around the room and saw a solemn pair of eyes studying me from the bed. She was sitting up, still dressed in the clothes she had worn the night before. She asked suspiciously, "Who are you?" I said jokingly, "Your knight in shining armor, at your service, madam." Mavis looked at him in disgust and replied, "No, who are you really?" Tact was needed, and I needed a reprieve between last night and our future together. Mavis was alive and breathing, not buried in an unmarked grave in Nicolet.
So we had a whole life ahead of us.
But the transition to this new life had to be carefully considered. Even without considering last night's drugs and rape, I knew the conversation would be crushing for both of us. I just couldn't bear to lose her again. I hadn't had my morning coffee yet.
So I lightheartedly said, "I never do anything involving my brain until I've had my first cup of coffee. Let's walk over to the hot spot and talk there." She said, "I need to take a bath and wash all this off me." She gestured down her body. I realized what she was saying. I said, "I think I should too. Why don't we meet there in an hour?" She smiled for the first time and said, "Breakfast is on you. You have a lot of explaining to do, young man." Her indomitable spirit returned to her. An hour later I was sitting at a table in the hotspot. I took a bath. Showers were rare in the 1940s, except in the barracks. I shaved and dressed in another of my new shirts. I felt like a new man. I said to Dot, "Bring 2 coffees over here, please," and sat down as far away from everyone as I could. A few minutes later Mavis came in. She was terribly beautiful and obviously furious. She was wearing a lightweight cashmere Betty and Veronica sweater, a pleated skirt, knee-length socks, and loafer shoes. It showed off her shapely beautiful legs and stunning brown hair. A small silk scarf was tied around her neck. Mavis sat down across from me. Dot put a cup of coffee in front of her. Dot, being Dot, cheekily asked, "Did Jimmy give this to you?" Mavis's too bling didn't mar her beauty in the least. Mavis laughed and replied, "No, I ran into the door, clumsy me." Dot looked at me and said earnestly, "I hope you've evened the score with the sheriff. Can you arrest him?" I laughed heartily and said, "I think he's in the hospital now and he's not as handsome as he was yesterday. Accidents happen, you know how they are." This was also a challenge for Mavis. She had lived with a guy before and had obviously fucked him. I wondered how she would react to the accident with her lover. Mavis made a beatific look, as if she had suddenly realized that God existed, and said with a sense of deep satisfaction, "Good." Dot nodded expressively and laughed. She had a couple of menus under her arm. She handed them to us, turned on her heel and walked away, continuing to giggle. Jimmy clearly didn't have many friends. I glanced at the menu, then looked up at a pair of porcelain blue eyes. They were boring into my brain. Mavis is a very smart and strong woman. Last night she was beaten, drugged, and raped. Many women would have been destroyed, unable to cope. Mavis wanted answers. I looked at her flawless face, every feature perfectly proportioned and calibrated beneath the mass of curly black hair, and a sense of relief swept over me. If I was dead, then so be it. This is where I wanted to be. I said, "You graduated from a normal school in Eau Claire and taught English literature in high school, so you must have read H.G. Wells, right?" Mavis looked startled. She asked indignantly, "How do you know that? Are you prying into my private life? I have rights, you know." Beaten, raped, and feisty. That's the kind of Mavis I loved. I laughed and said, "Relax, that's part of the story. But you're going to have to open your mind. You know H.G. Wells, The Time Machine?" She nodded her head in agreement and said, "I assigned it to my students." I asked, "Do you believe any of this can happen?" She laughed and said, "Nonsense. Of course it can't be. What are you getting at?" I felt that the discussion wasn't going the way I wanted it to. Mavis would probably walk away if I told her the real story. So I laughed and said, "I just wanted to find out how open-minded you are." I realized how weak it sounded as soon as I said it. She said grimly, like an inquisitor, "You called me your wife last night." I realized that I wasn't going to get out of this situation. So I said, "Sorry, that's a figure of speech. I meant to say that this is my future wife." I smiled disarmingly and said, "I would have added, and the mother of my children, but I thought that was over the top." She smiled back seductively and said, "Oh ho. Well, aren't you a daredevil? What makes you think I'd give you the time of day?" I looked at her with serious eyes and said, "You felt the attraction." Hell, even Jimmy noticed it. I don't know what came over me. But I can't imagine my life without you. It was too far over the line, and there was too much sincerity in my words. Losing Mavis was so terrible that I couldn't even talk about it without emotion in my voice. That really bothered Mavis. I was quickly silent. Mavis said angrily, "How can you say that? I don't even know you." I jokingly said, "Maybe we were married in another life? Maybe that explains it?" She swallowed convulsively, the way women do when their emotions run too wild. I'd expected our mutual love to bring things to their inevitable conclusion, but it clearly hadn't. She said with irritation in her voice, "I don't know who you are or why you're messing with me. But, yes, I felt that there was something important between us." She was getting angrier and angrier by the second. "I can't figure out what the reason is, and it's bothering me. I remember almost everything that happened last night, including the involuntary sex, and I know you saved me. But if you can't explain what you just said, you need to back off." So it came to chopping nuts. I tried to speak in my most persuasive voice, "Let's go somewhere private. You won't believe what I'm about to tell you. But I expect that the fact that you trusted me in the past will help you trust me now." We walked into her little apartment. It was a cozy place. She had a living room with a couple of upholstered chairs, a table in front of the window with a small lamp on it, and a floor lamp next to one chair. It was in that chair that I slept last night. A cheap but clean hooked rug lay on the painted wooden floor. A couple of bookcases held racks of books. Mavis noticed where I was looking and said modestly, "I like to read." I knew this because she had lived in the library when we were married. There was a bed against the wall, neatly made. There was one more room, and that was the bathroom. It looked like Mavis was cooking on the stove. I sat in one chair. She sat in another. I noticed how orderly everything was. There was no clutter, no pots and pans in the small sink. Mavis was an excellent homemaker, and it was obvious that neatness was a deeply ingrained part of her personality. She stared at me intently. The 2 bruises were bothersome, but they didn't distract from her porcelain skin, the natural shape and deep intelligence of her eyes. Her thick black eyebrows were arched. She waited for me to tell my story. Well, as the British say, in for a penny, in for a pound. I said, "Everything I'm about to tell you is true. I have no way of proving it. But I want you to trust your feelings. They will help you to see that I am honest." I sighed and began, "We were married for 9 years. We loved each other very much. We had a beautiful daughter named Ava. This is the only proof I have that it happened." I rummaged in my pocket and pulled out my cell phone. It was off. I needed to save the battery for this moment. I could see Mavis was about to burst into flames. But she was distracted by the phone. She looked puzzled. She asked, "What is it?" I said, "That's my phone." This is how we make calls in the 21st century.
Mavis let that pass her ears.
Then it hit her. She said in amazement, "Wait a minute. Did you say 21st century?"
She looked incredulous.
I said lightly, "Shut your mouth or you'll be catching flies." When the phone booted up, I said, "I can't use it for phone calls. Because it depends on other technology. But it will confirm what I'm about to say." Mavis looked unconvinced.
Anyone would react that way if a complete stranger showed up in their living room and told a completely absurd story like mine. I looked into her eyes, wanting her to believe what I was about to say.
I said, "I know what I'm saying sounds crazy and maybe I'm scaring you. But I think you can see that my phone is not from this era." She nodded hesitantly.
At that moment, the phone's desktop appeared on the screen.
On it was a recent photo of Ava in a Badgers cheerleading uniform.
She was stunningly beautiful, just like her mother.
Mavis asked stunned, "Where did you get my picture?" I said, "It's not you, it's our daughter Ava. She's 21 years old, and until 3 days ago, she was my only memory of our life together." I said, "I know that your history with men tells you that you would be a fool to trust me. But let me assure you that our love was real, and this young woman is the fruit of it." Mavis looked like she was suffering from sensory overload. It was understandable. Any normal person would have reacted that way. I said pleadingly, "I'm betting my life and happiness on one roll of the dice and will do whatever it takes to make you believe my words are true." I dutifully added, "But we have already gone through the event that brought us together. So I will accept your decision if you choose to live your life without me." I looked at her, trying to convey my sincerity. I said, "I've been a pretty good lawman in this town, in the future, and they've already offered me the sheriff's position for a while. If I'm stuck in the 1940s, I'll take their offer." Then I leaned back in my chair and waited for her reaction. Mavis is a very strong and practical woman. When I first met her, she had already come to terms with her new reality and was dealing with it courageously. Most people would not have been able to readjust. I was counting on her agile mind to accept that we loved each other in the future, even if my only proof was a photograph recorded on a technological device she would never understand. I sat there, not hiding my feelings. The man around whom I had built my life was a complete stranger. But we had once loved each other, and it was clear from our interactions that the magic had been working for decades. Mavis looked at me with a face that had a mask of concentration frozen on it. I said as affectionately and gently as possible, "One night you came out of nowhere. You thought it was today, August 1st, 1946. I was the sheriff and took care of you while we tried to figure out who you were and where you came from." Mavis looked incredulous. I hastily continued, "We investigated and eventually concluded that you were killed by Felix Wynne." Mavis looked completely stunned. She knew I was talking about last night. I added softly, "We closed the case, although the suggestion that you solved your own murder was crazy." Mavis laughed. She said, "That's the most ridiculous story I've ever heard." I rushed to finish. I said, "By then we were very much in love and eventually got married. We conceived Ava before we got married. But the timing was not important." Seeing that Mavis was starting to squirm again, I pulled out my second best card. I said, "We led a happy life in our home. Do you know where this house was located?" She shook her head puzzled, "No." She didn't understand why I had even asked the question. I said with growing confidence, "This is where we had our picnic." "I know you felt it. I saw it." For the first time, Mavis looked at me like she was starting to believe me. I said, "After 9 years of wedded bliss, they dug up the body." "You sap. Art at the same moment, leaving Ava and me to our fate." Mavis looked even more thoughtful. Then I played my trump card. I said, "I am a simple and practical man. I wasn't sure if something supernatural had happened. But I buried the body they dug up on my property." I added with grim emphasis, "You were standing on your own grave when you passed out." Mavis looked shocked. In that instant it was as if she had perceived the truth. The feeling overwhelmed her. Some women might cry. Some will lose their minds. Others get angry. Mavis is different.
I realized that the night she had her first suspicions about the murder. She can be smart and practical.
But Mavis is a deeply intuitive person.
What she feels and how she reacts are the best indicators of truth for her.
She's not slutty by any means.
She just trusts her deepest instincts. In essence, Mavis listens to what her heart tells her. So it was almost inevitable that she would try to test what I had just told her by doing what she did next. Mavis rose from her chair in all her self-assured feminine glory. She was very sure of her sexuality. She took my hand and led me to the bed without a word. She nudged me into a sitting position. Her gaze was smoldering. She sat down next to me and turned to face me, her lips 6 inches from mine.
She said, breathing heavily, "Let's do a little experiment to find out if the absurd story you just told me is true."
Then she put one arm around my neck, the other around the back of my head, and we kissed for the first time in 10 years.
It was like touching a live wire. A lightning bolt of emotion swept through time and obliterated all regret and anguish and all hesitation.
She threw her head back, stunned by the sensation. Then her eyes clouded with lust, and she dragged me back to the bed.
I looked at her in amazement and thought, what a woman. She muttered, "What has happened to me? I've never experienced such pleasure in my life."
Then she looked at him puzzled and said to herself, "We didn't do anything but kiss."
Then she smirked and said seductively, "This will probably kill me. But you have to make love to me right now."
I assumed there would be foreplay. But she flipped me onto my back as soon as we were back in each other's arms. The whole thing was erotically motivating.
I didn't ask to come back to this place. I never imagined it could happen. I've been pining for Mavis for almost 11 long years.
And now, call it fate or the last thoughts of a dead man. But, as unbelievable as it may seem, I have made love to my dear departed wife.
Mavis was not in the mood for such abstract thoughts.
Because she hadn't experienced our life together. I finally regained a little bit of consciousness and regained my breath.
My pulse was finally under 200 and the goosebumps were gone.
I looked at her favorite face.
And then it hit me. Mavis called me by my first name. She didn't know my name, just Sheriff.
She slowly came back to me, letting out soft sobs and moans.
Finally she opened those beautiful eyes and looked up at me. It was like dawn over the Garden of Eden.
Her wonderfully deep and intelligent face mesmerized me.
There was devotion in it. I couldn't even begin to guess what the explanation was. But it's happened before.
Call it psychic, religious, delusional, but the first time we were together, fate gave Mavis a vision of her own death. Understandably, she was in a state of mindless panic as she ran to my bedside. After I calmed her down, we made love for the first time.
I said in surprise, "You remembered." She said, "I don't remember many details.
But I do know that I loved you with all my heart and that our marriage was joyful and happy.
More importantly, I know that I will always love you."
Her face darkened as she said, "I was making a snack for Ava before I picked her up from school."
Then I felt dizzy and nauseous. It felt like I was about to pass out. I remember being overcome with a feeling of regret.
And then there was just blackness.
That reminded her. She gasped loudly and said, "My God, what will happen to Ava? Will I ever see her again?"
I tried the same explanation I used for myself.
I said, "The future is our past. That means 70 years from now."
When I left, our girl was a strong and capable young woman. I also pointed out that Ava had a whole town behind her, including Doc and his wife and the Jensens. I finished, "She has a bright future, no matter what timeline she's in. Maybe we'll even live long enough to meet her.
But for now, let's just spend our lives together." I accepted the town's offer.
I had been sheriff there for years.
But that was 7 decades ago. Now I needed to provide for my wife and the child growing in her womb.
Being sheriff seemed like a great way to do that. I knew I was a guest in Mavis's time, as she was in mine. I was also painfully aware of the fact that Mavis had disappeared the moment we dug up her murdered body. It was a classic paradox of being, she could not be dead and alive at the same time. So the first state prevailed over the second. Now I was in the same situation. I knew I would disappear the moment I was born, which was 27 years later. I didn't want to ever leave Mavis. I wanted to die in her arms. But my departure was a foregone conclusion. I could not be both newborn and ready to retire at the same time. So my disappearance was inevitable. But I had a plan. It was a gorgeous July day and we were watching a cute little brown girl eating an ice cream cone. America had survived Korea, Joe McCarthy, the Vietnam War, the Flower Power Revolution, and Richard Nixon. It was the country's bicentennial and the president was a former Michigan soccer player. Mavis and I were hanging around the Belleville American Music Festival area. The locals call it BAMFest. It's an annual event, and it plays some pretty good blues. Students from nearby Madison come there in droves. In her 56 years, Mavis was as gorgeous as ever. The only thing the three children had done to her figure was to increase her bust size. She still had slender legs and a firm ass. But her glory was her stunning face, which was still wrinkle-free. I nodded toward a guy in his early 20s. He was making his way through the crowd. He looked unsure and awkward, like he didn't think he belonged here. He was a good-looking guy, tall and muscular, clearly a farmer, not a college student. Mavis squeezed my hand lovingly. Then she walked toward him. She tugged on his arm and said coquettishly, "Would you mind showing me where the food carts are?" She put all her legendary fervor into this request. The boy started to point his finger, but then looked intently at the woman who had asked the question. Mavis was old enough to be his mom. But no mom had ever been like Mavis. This set the lad's mind at rest. He said impatiently, "I'll take you." What the hell? It was worth a guy going a little out of his way if he could spend time with such a wonderful woman. As they were leaving, Mavis turned to me and winked. Meanwhile, the girl finished her ice cream cone and wandered towards the parking lot. She was obviously looking for her friends. And lo and behold, the guy didn't bump into the girl. The girl didn't spill her ice cream. There was no apology. There was no instant attraction. There was no dating, there was no marriage. And I was never born. Epilogue. Ava Jensen stopped by the hotspot. She was starting a tour with the Joffrey Theater the following week, and it was her last day in town. The 21-year-old from Wisconsin had rarely been successful in the world of professional dance. But she worked hard to get there and believed in her destiny. Ava knew she was adopted. The Jensens couldn't have children. But they cherished and loved Ava as if she were their own. And Penny Jensen's wisdom and support created the beautiful, intelligent, and very successful woman Ava is today. The octogenarian owner of the hotspot was sitting in the back booth. She was there with a woman much older than herself. This woman was somewhere in her 90s. But the shadow of her rare beauty still lingered, like the ruins of a particularly exquisite and graceful classical temple. Ava had a fleeting thought, surely my own mother must have looked like her. Ava came to the Jensens very young. She didn't remember her birth parents or the circumstances that had brought her to the Jensens. But sometimes she felt like she'd lived two very different childhoods. The old woman's name was Mavis. It was one of those old lady names. Mavis had been married to the former sheriff of the county for 70 years. He had recently passed away. Their marriage served as a beacon of hope for those who still believed a lifelong romance was possible. Mavis and her husband were very wealthy. The sheriff had an amazing ability to invest in unheard-of ventures that later became legendary corporations such as IBM, McDonald's, Microsoft, and Apple. It was as if he saw the future. Yet, even with all their wealth, the sheriff and Mavis had lived their entire lives in this humble town. They raised their children here and always treated Ava as if she were one of their own brood. Ava was especially dear to Mavis. It was as if she were her surrogate great-granddaughter. So Ava wasn't surprised when Mavis invited her to the table. Mavis said, "Before you leave town, I have something to tell you." The old woman was physically frail.
But she had powerful, porcelain blue eyes that radiated an invincible spirit.
Mavis rose heavily from her chair, and the driver helped her out of the car.
Ava sat down beside her. The drive to the sheriff's huge estate was silent. Mavis seemed to be formulating her thoughts.
The estate took up the entire bluff outside of town. The house itself was a replica of a classic Victorian mansion, though it was actually only 30 years old. The huge lawn was bright green and meticulously manicured. The sound of a lawnmower echoed
in the hot July sun, and Ava could smell the freshly cut grass.
A small stream ran past the house.
An intricate iron bridge crossed it.
But instead of walking toward the house, the old woman turned and followed a perfectly manicured cedar shavings path. It led to a secluded grove at the top of a small hill above the mill pond. The two women sat on a marble bench next to the sheriff's grave.
A giant willow tree girdled the entire space with its distinctive branches.
The air was filled with the sounds of insects, birdsong, and a soft summer breeze.
Mavis looked toward the monumental tombstone. A tender and loving expression appeared on her face. The sheriff's name and her name were engraved on the monument.
Only the date of Mavis's death remained to be inscribed.
They sat like that for a minute. Mavis was old and frail. Ava was smooth and lively, like a big cat. Mavis was at the end of her life. Ava was just entering her prime. Ava had an exquisite face, black hair, and blue eyes.
Her extraordinary body had been honed by hours of hard dance training. And yet there was something indescribably similar about the two of them. The old woman turned to Ava and gave her a serious, almost pleading look. Mavis seemed to want to convey something very important to her. Mavis said with deep sincerity, "It was fate that brought the sheriff and I together, and I know that fate will reunite us.
I pray for that every day of my life." She sighed and said with genuine relief, "It won't be long."
Then the old woman stopped.
She took both of Ava's thin, beautiful hands in hers. Mavis's hands were mottled with age spots.
She said, "Fate is fickle, and sometimes its twists and turns are hard to understand or accept.
But you can't change the lay of the cards. So you have to play the best you can. That's what your father and I did with you then, and that's what we expect you to do now. We're very rich and we love you very much. So you're gonna be taken care of for the rest of your life. I just wanted you to know that before I passed away." Ava shuddered. She had felt it from the beginning. It was impossible to explain why. But Ava knew it was all true. And she was overcome with wonder at it all. The end.